Today I'm interviewing Ash Routh, who is standing to be Deputy Leader of the Green Party.
I'm Ash Routh. I'm a member of Standing Orders Committee, and for the last two elections, I was our candidate in Wakefield. So Wakefield and Rothwell, and then prior to that, Wakefield.
Why did you join the Green Party and why do you think other people should?
Well, I joined the Green Party quite a long time ago. It was about 2010, so very different political environment. I was very young. I was 20, and that was my first general election that I got to vote in. I just looked at all of the parties and tried to work out which one most aligned with my views. And at the time, it was the Green Party. So I would say, in a way, it was sort of a whim. I just decided it was a thing I was going to do and sat and looked through all the manifestos and went from there. I think the political environment has changed quite a lot since then. I think certainly the perception of the Green Party in 2010 was very much this is a single issue party. And I think now we are increasingly, maybe not as far as we'd like to be, but increasingly being seen as a potential party of governance, a party with a range of policies. I think that realistically, we need to embrace being a mass membership organization, embrace professionalizing the party and expanding our reach and expanding our scope, which we've done a lot of in the last 15 years, but we need to do that more, which means we need to get members in and reach out to communities that we don't currently reach out. So I guess my pitch to people when I say join the Green Party is you've got a direct voice in the Green Party that you wouldn't have in any other party. If you joined the Labour Party, for example, your votes can be ignored. You can pass policy at conference and it's going to be disregarded. If you come here in the Green Party, you're part of a movement where every single vote is counted exactly the same. And that is how governance should work. So you be part of creating a model for better governance for the whole country, hopefully, in our lifetime.
How do we balance the need for infrastructure projects with protecting the environment?
If we're talking about infrastructure projects that are, environmentally necessary, then I think that is a thing that we have to prioritize, and we have to recognize that you can't make an omelette without cracking a few eggs. That being said, I think there's a right way to do things. I've been quite strongly opposed to HS2 for a very long time because I think it's a good example of a heavily greenwashed project managed very badly. Realistically, I think Green Party support helps that greenwashing, which is why I've always opposed Green Party supporting HS2. I think we do need major infrastructure projects, and I think there's a real danger when we oppose them that we get called NIMBYs, Tories on bikes, things like that. I think we need to pick our battles very, very carefully. And when we do oppose an infrastructure project, we need to front foot the very strong case why we're doing it. If there is a very precious piece of woodland that's being destroyed that is completely unnecessary and could be worked around, we need to make sure we're front footing that. We need to make sure that newspapers can't go Green Party opposes solar farms, which I think is incredibly harmful to our image. First and foremost, I think we should support green infrastructure projects. As a secondary concern, we should make sure that they are being done the right way, and that when we do have to oppose them, we're doing that the right way.
The UK Supreme Court has ruled that for the purposes of the Equality Act 2010, the definition of sex is biological sex, not gender identity. What's your position on that?
I don't think it changes, certainly my understanding of how the law has worked. For me, it's very, very clear, set out in the Equality Act, the protections that we have. And the law as it is suggests that trans people should be treated as their acquired gender unless there's a proportional means to a legitimate aim to not do so. Now, this is where I differ with a lot of my trans siblings. I think that for a lot of them, the assumption was that this proportional means to a legitimate aim protection meant it would be, in practice, very difficult for a service provider to justify exclusion of trans people. I've never been of that view. I think probably almost any plausible argument would have been considered legally acceptable if it went to a court and it went to a challenge. So I have always operated under the assumption and the understanding that trans people should be welcomed unless the service provider considers there a need to, require trans people to use facilities we'd be less comfortable in. I just wouldn't go to those facilities. If a pub told me, oh, you have to use this toilet, not this toilet, I wouldn't go to that pub. I think that realistically, most service providers aren't interested in arbitrarily excluding trans people. I think that was true before the Supreme Court ruling. I think it remains true. Maybe it would be easier for a service provider to argue that it's a proportionate means to a legitimate aim to exclude a trans person from a certain space now. I never thought that would be difficult to do in the first place. So I think that in terms of my day-to-day life, I don't think it changes very much. What I'm much more worried about is people misrepresenting this ruling. I've seen a lot of examples of people suggesting that this ruling says something that it doesn't say, and it does something that it doesn't do. It doesn't, for example, require trans women to use men's toilets. It doesn't require trans men to use women's, trans women to use men's. It doesn't say that. It's not a requirement. It's an option that can be exercised by a service provider, but it's certainly not a requirement. And I think far more dangerous is people misrepresenting it. Because when people misrepresent it and service providers believe those misrepresentations, I think that's far more dangerous to trans people. So the ruling itself, I'm not so worried about. It's people in bad faith or perhaps by accident misrepresenting what it says and what it means that worries me a lot more.
What do you say when people ask you how we should fund public services and investment?
We should be taxing the wealthy. It's pretty straightforward. I think that there's been a move in the media lately to sort of make this argument that if you tax the wealthy too much, that they'll leave the country, which I think is quite obviously ridiculous and a distraction. First of all, if we establish a system whereby we only tax the wealthy as much as we think they'll be willing to pay, well, that's going to be a race to the bottom very quickly. And I think in practical terms, we don't actually need millionaires and billionaires to be in this country. If they make money in this country and they hold money in this country, then we can tax their money in this country, irrespective of whether they are physically present here or not. If you own an extremely successful business in the UK that makes a lot of money, it can be taxed. And realistically, as long as that business is still profitable to you, you are still going to have an interest in doing so. I don't really mind if millionaires and billionaires leave. Their businesses can't. And as long as their businesses are profitable, they're not going to take those away. So I think it's a sort of nonsense argument. That is clearly where we should be taxing people. It is clear to me that the people with the most ability to pay should be paying at least a proportional amount to everyone else. And I mean percentage, not like amount of money spent on tax. So yeah, I think that's fundamental and quite clear in Green Party policy as well.
What do you think the UK's relationship to NATO should be?
It's a tricky one. I have always been quite dubious as to the practicalities of NATO. I think you only need to pick up a history book to see that, agreements to go to war are followed as often as they're not followed. It's not like it's a legally binding thing and that you could take another country to court for not declaring war. I'm very dubious that NATO works the way it's sort of designed to. I think the fact that Russia has been able to invade Ukraine without any action. I appreciate Ukraine not a NATO member, but we are signatories of the Budapest Memorandum. When Ukraine became independent from the Soviet Union, they had all these nuclear weapons. They gave them up in exchange for a promise of territorial integrity, which has not been respected at all by any of the signatory states, including the UK. I don't know why people have so much faith in NATO. And for me, I think it's a philosophical, fundamental thing. I'm a strong believer in not seeking violent solutions. It's a fundamental thing for Quakers, and I think a fundamental, foundational belief for the Green Party. I appreciate there are practical concerns. I'm not trying to change the Green Party's position on this, but for me, I'm extremely skeptical of NATO, and I'm really not in support of alliances that commit us to wars, because A, I don't think they're actually binding, and B, I think it's quite a dangerous approach to think about wars. I think it's a dangerous way to think about wars. So I'm very dubious and critical about NATO, but I'm not trying to change the Green Party position. That is just a sort of philosophical, religious position for me.
What is your feeling on electoral pacts and working with other organisations and candidates?
I think that in an ideal world, I trust voters to be able to make informed choices, and I think it's actually quite dangerous to assume that we understand how votes will transfer. I think that things that were common sense and obvious in politics 10 years ago aren't necessarily so now. We live in the time of green reform swing seats. They're a very real thing. There are voters who, like, those are the two parties they're thinking about voting for. And I think it's quite dangerous for us to assume that if we were to enter into a pact with another party and were we to not stand, that we would be able to correctly predict where those votes would move to. I think voters can make informed decisions. And so I think that even in tight seats, and I'm aware there are some examples of, Tory MPs who could have lost their seats had the Greens not stood and had the people who voted Green voted for Labour or the Lib Dems in those particular seats. But we don't know that that would have happened. And also, I think a little insulting to those voters to assume that they need to sort of be corralled into voting a certain way. I am a strong supporter of us standing in every seat. I think if there's ever a motion presented to conference in support of that, I'm always going to support that. And if I'm ever in a local party that is considering not standing, I'm going to vote in opposition to that. That being said, I am completely comfortable with local parties being the ultimate arbiters of their decision, unless there is a conference motion once again, binding the party in standing every seat, as there was for this last general election. I don't support it, but I support the right of members to vote in favour of it if they want to.
So that policy was just for the last election. That's not standing. So it's just for my own interest.
Yeah.
So it's not current policy. So the next election, we're not bound to stand in every seat.
I can't speak for Standing Orders Committee who interpret motions, but that is my understanding.
Okay.
That being said, there are some complications with that motion, which I won't bore you with, but the outcome of some rulings from Standing Orders Committee were that that process was a little flawed, and that there was a constitutionally correct mechanism for local parties to not stand. It's quite complicated. I think either way, there's going to be a motion about it before we have another general election.
Yeah. I talk about it on social media virtually every day, so I'm just trying to get my facts.
Yeah. If you drop me an email afterwards, I can send you the relevant SOC rulings. Okay. But yeah, there's some interesting interactions with the Constitution on it, which are not that interesting, but you might find.
How do you think we can better convey the urgency and impact of the climate crisis?
I think that we need to change our image. I think that we are seen as very middle class, very safe. I think that the way we present ourselves and the way we talk to voters isn't actually very appealing. I don't think we speak directly to voters in our messaging. I think sometimes we speak sort of over or past them a little bit. It's an accepted science, but some people, like a lot of people's decision about which parties they back are based on sort of emotional resonances, and us being able to point to a textbook doesn't evoke those kind of feelings. I think we need to take more time sitting down and talking to voters where they are at politically, rather than making assumptions about what they know and what they accept as fact and what they wouldn't challenge. I think we need to fundamentally change our messaging. I think it needs to be I think it needs to focus on working class people and on marginalized communities that we aren't approaching and aren't reaching out to. I don't think we need to do any more work reaching out to Middle England. I think we've done quite a lot of that.
How would you, as deputy, support getting Greens off the ground in areas with little or no Green Party at the moment?
I think we've got a good guidebook for this, Target to Win. It does work. It's a very, very good way, especially of breaking through and getting that first councillor in an area. In terms of what I would do specifically as deputy, I've been around the block a bit, and I've been to action days that have been attended by our leaders and by deputy leaders. And I think that often they're flying visits, and they're necessarily flying visits. Here's somebody coming, they're going to come, drop in on our day, they'll be with us for maybe an hour, and then they've got to hop onto a train to go to another town or city to do the same thing again. That's a lot of photo ops, and I recognize that there is value in that, and I recognize also that we only have a leadership team of 3 and they have a lot to do. I think for me as a deputy leader, certainly in the run up to the next general election, being a deputy leader would be my full-time job. I wouldn't split commitments with being MP or being a councillor. It would be as far as I'm concerned, my full-time job. And what I would like to do when I'm going to visit local parties to support them is to actually spend the time there supporting them. I'd like to spend a day there. I'd like to knock on the doors. I'd like to deliver the leaflets, because I think that that's got a lot more value than a photo op. I think actually getting to know those parties, getting to know the people there, and showing that they are a priority and they are a focus is going to get more people willing to volunteer, more people willing to engage, more people willing to do those important leaflet rounds, going out canvassing. I don't want to be stopping off for an hour in places. I want to be spending the day in places. And that would be what I would do as deputy leader, because I wouldn't have anything else to do. That would be what I'm there to do.
We don't have a whip system in the Green Party. How would you manage the difference between your personal views and Green Party policy?
There are vanishingly few differences between my views and Green Party policy, which I'm grateful for. But I'm a firm believer that when it comes to Green Party policy, I'm there to represent it. And so I think that were I an MP or the House of Lords or anything else, and I was casting a vote and I was looking at my view versus the Green Party's view, my preference is that I try and be a sincere representative of the party that I'm here to represent. And so I would favour the party's view. I could see perhaps there being, if I'm an MP and some policy has changed since I became an MP, maybe that's slightly more consideration, because I sort of wasn't elected to do that until after the policies changed. If there's some radical U-turn on something. But broadly speaking, I think that it's more important to be a sincere representative of the party. And so that is what would guide me when I was voting on something as a Green Party representative.
How do we make a bigger impact with the media?
We need to be punchier. We need to be more entertaining. We need to be funnier. We play it super, super safe with how we represent ourselves. I think that there is a tendency, we look very middle class, we look a little bit like university lecturers. People, if they're interested in what we're talking about, they'll listen to us. But if they're not, it's hard for us to capture their interest. I think we should be more punchy, more entertaining. I hate to admit it, but Nigel Farage is probably one of the more entertaining men in politics. And I think if you look back a little bit, Boris Johnson's entire political career before it came crashing down around his head was very much rooted in the fact that he'd been able to sell himself as somebody who was entertaining and interesting. Boris Johnson had fans. Not many politicians do. I think we need to be more like that. I think we need to be actually seeking the interest of audiences rather than just trying to be right, being able to say, I told you so, which is a big change to our image, but I think it's one we should chase before the next general election.
What do you think of the Green Party electoral strategy known as Target to Win? You mentioned this there.
I already talked up Target to Win. I think it's a really, really good way to, like I said, break through those first councillors on a seat. I think it's really, really useful tool for us. It's not everything. It's not the be all and end all. It is a strategy that we follow that is good for getting a foothold. I don't think it's necessarily fit for purpose for us to try and, for example, win enough seats to form a majority government. I've talked about reform a little bit. Like they've won council seats where they haven't done any work on the ground, and it's purely off the back of their messaging. I think that we need a strong messaging strategy alongside Target to Win, because I think that's how we start uplifting our vote nationwide even if we haven't actually necessarily got that many volunteers in the area delivering leaflets, knocking on doors year round, which we don't have enough people to do in enough seats at the same time for us to actually form a majority government. So we need to look beyond it if we're going to ever form a majority government. I think it's good, but it's not everything.
What's your approach to people who disagree with you?
I like to sit down with them and talk. I think it's a really good. I think it's a really good thing to do, just generally, personally. It's a good way to understand other people, to show empathy, and to sort of prove your own views. I don't mean prove like prove. I mean prove like test. Um, I have had my views changed by Green Party members by sitting down with them over a cup of tea and having a chat about a topic. I think that's a really good thing. I'm not afraid of changing my perspective. I'm always open to it. I try to be as open to it as I can. And similarly, I'm always happy to explain my perspective to somebody else who's curious about it, because that's a good thing too. I think common understanding is a really good thing. And I think that even if you can't necessarily find agreement with somebody, if you can find common understanding where you understand their perspective and they understand yours, you've both come away much richer for it. I think it's a good thing to do. That's what I do whenever I can. If somebody vociferously disagrees with me on something, my first reflex is to invite them for a cup of tea and have a chat, which sometimes people do and sometimes people don't. And sometimes it changes minds, sometimes it doesn't.
Which Green Party policy would you change?
I mean, I've spoken about our policy on HS2, and I've spoken about our policy with regards to NATO. I I think on HS2, I've said this to many Greens many times. Once HS2 got cancelled, I didn't really understand what the argument was for the Green Party to support it, because even HS2's biggest supporters agree that it took too long, it cost too much money, a lot of mistakes were made, that it wasn't very well managed, and are effectively arguing, but we should finish it anyway, which is an argument I appreciate. But the point at which it got cancelled, once the Green Party endorses an infrastructure project, it is as green as it ever needs to be. Because once they can go, the Green Party support this project, for most people, that's a green project. They've got no reason to try and make the project any greener, any more environmentally responsible once it has our endorsement. So I think that our endorsement should have a high standard, because it is effectively the ceiling, not the floor. If we were a majority government and we're looking at a flawed infrastructure project and considering finishing it, I appreciate that's a different kind of situation. Right now we have 4 MPs. We are not the fate of HS2, and therefore I think it's probably better generally for infrastructure projects if we make it clear that we set a standard for our endorsement, and it's one that has to be worked towards, that can't be easily attained. I stand by that. I think it was a mistake to revise our position, and I think that we should set a necessarily high standard for Green Party support, like Green Party endorsement of infrastructure projects. So HS2.
Great, thanks. Again, I'm going to cut this bit out, but it was one I voted to finish HS2 at conference.
Sure.
But you might have just changed my mind. The Green Party has a reputation for lack of racial diversity. How do we attract non-white members and voters to the Green Party?
Yeah. I was looking through our manifesto for last general election, and the word race doesn't appear in it, and the word racism only appears once, and it's in a line about tackling institutional racism in policing. I think part of our problem is, I'm going to use the manifesto as an example here. If you want to be on the group that collates the manifesto, that puts it together from our policy, you'd need to get yourself onto Green Party Regional Council, which usually would require you to be a member for at least 2 years, and then maybe even more so to actually attract the support to get elected. And then within that body, you'd have to get elected to be on the manifesto working group. I think our governance can be quite labyrinthine, and I think it can favour, I'm going to put quotation marks, party grandees, people who've been kicking around for quite a long time. which means I think that there is an inbuilt delay on us getting better on how we represent groups that we've historically been not so hot on representing, whether that's people of color, whether that's working class people, whether that's any number of groups. I think that probably a really useful first step would be to make our governance a little bit more grassroots. Like, I would like to see people having major input on our manifesto and how it's structured and what's prioritized, not needing to have been kicking around in the party for a couple of years, not needing to have been elected to specific posts, not needing to be party grandees. I think we could do a lot more low to the ground management of the party, a lot more low to the ground governance, which means newer members and members with like less big names are able to point out pretty major problems. Because I think that if somebody had been able to go, nobody's talking about race in this manifesto, that would have been fixed. But nobody was, and the group that like the body that did it, which I was on at the time, not as a member of the manifesto working group, but I was on the regional council at the time, predominantly very white, predominantly very middle class. So yeah, I think if we change our party governance, we get a lot more low to the ground with our decision making processes. I think we can probably become more representative more quickly rather than having a 2 or 3 year delay. So that I think would be a really big first step. I know there are a lot of governance reforms coming to conference. I think people should look at them very closely and keep that in mind.
How can we assure disabled people that the Green Party is listening to them?
There's a lot of basics that we are getting wrong. A lot of local party meetings that are in buildings that don't have step-free access. A lot of emails going out asking people to go out and deliver leaflets and knock on doors, but they aren't presenting ways for members to get involved and to help with campaigns that don't require a degree of physical ability. I think a lot of that basic stuff really, really puts people off. You know, how accessible our conferences have been has improved over recent years, but certainly historically, it's not been amazing. I think that you lose people if they can't get through the front door, literally or metaphorically. People aren't going to spend their time working in an organization where they have to really, really work hard just to actually gain access, to actually be heard, to actually be valued and respected. I think that bare bones stuff would be a really positive step to getting people more involved with the party. It sounds obvious, it's really basic stuff, but it is happening a lot all over the country in the party. I think it's something we should improve on.
How important is social class in politics?
Huge, massive, very important. um, I've been talking about class quite a lot this evening. It's enormous. I think it's probably the biggest divider in society. I think the gap between sort of upper class and middle and lower is much higher than it is between middle and working class people. But it is huge. It defines so many things. It affects your life expectancy. It affects your attainment of positive health outcomes. It affects your likelihood of being employed above a certain pay scale. It just affects everything. And I think we should talk about it more. I think that environmentalism is often looked at as a very middle class pursuit. It's very easy when you are comfortable, when your bills are paid, when you're not living paycheck to paycheck, to think in the abstract about how you'd like to give yourself that warm, fuzzy feeling inside by knowing you're doing your bit by cutting out certain foods or, doing certain things. We aren't talking to people living on the breadline in that same way. We aren't appealing to them in the same way. And those are the people being most disproportionately affected by climate change. And those are the people who are going to suffer the most as it gets worse. I think social class is everything in politics. And I really wish there were more conversations had about it, because I think a lot of people really don't realize, this system of oppression that exists around them, that for many of them is seriously harming them.
What other issues are important to you?
it worries me how hostile politics has become. Like I'm relatively young. I'm 35, but 2010 feels very different to 2020, and I think 2025 feels very different to 2020, almost more so, even though it's over a smaller period. I think politics has become very hostile, and it's become very um, about your team winning rather than about talking about ideas and consensus making. And it really, really worries me. Um, I'm going to liken it to being a football fan. If your team gets relegated a bunch of times, you stick with them. Of course you do. You know, you don't like the manager, you don't like the players that have been hired. You stick with them because they're your team, right? I think it's really dangerous if that kind of mindset leaks into politics. I vote this way no matter what. I'm a Labour voter, even though Labour is not friendly to unions. I'm a Labour voter because my dad was a Labour voter. I'm a Labour voter because Labour repealed Section 28. I think it's really dangerous. People are getting really tribal about it and getting really wedded to their team and getting increasingly hostile to other people. And I think it's making it harder and harder for people to cross the floor, to change their mind, to have conversations about politics, and to widen their perspective, widen their viewpoint, and to practice empathy. And I think the loss of empathy in politics is um, really, really regrettable. And um, it really worries me. It genuinely, sincerely worries me. Like newspaper recently, Chancellor of the Exchequer was crying in PMQs. Ha ha ha! Very funny. She had something going on. I don't know what it was. I don't need to know what it was. But like, I feel like that is a symbol of the loss of empathy in politics, um, and that's what I would change because it really worries me and it really upsets me, and I think it's a shame. And I think if it gets worse, we're headed to a really dark place politically.
Why do you think you should be deputy leader of the Green Party, and what will you do if you're elected?
Um, I don't think I should be deputy leader. I think that somebody who represents a serious change should be deputy leader, which I think I am. I think we need more working class representation. We really, really need somebody based in the north. There's a whole half of the country that feels left behind. We didn't target any seats north of Leicester, which meant in the general election, northern activists were having to go on very, very, very long trips to our target seats, or were having to work in seats that we knew the Green Party wasn't prioritising. I think we need somebody northern. I think we need somebody working class. I think we need somebody who is entertaining, is able to work an audience, is able to get a laugh out of people. Um, I think I am these things, but I think that people should elect a leadership team that they think are actually going to meaningfully, beneficially change how the Green Party is seen, which I think I could be a part of. But far more important than voting for me, I think, is people not voting for more of the same style of how the party presents itself. I would like us to make a serious, serious breakthrough in the polls like Reform has. I don't want us to just gently, gently trundle our way to win 6 or 8 seats in the next general election. Because if I generously assume that we can now quadruple our number of seats every general election, by the time we can form a majority government, so much damage is going to have been done. It's going to be so, so difficult. We need to break through faster, which means we can't do more of the same. So I would say, whether it's me or not, people should vote for people that they think can deliver that kind of change.